in the Cuba. Therefore, I will not restrain my mouth. I will speak in the anguish of my spirit. I will complain in the bitterness of my soul. Am I the sea or a sea monster that thou settest a guard over me? When I say my bed will comfort me, my couch will ease my complaint, then thou dost scare me with dreams and terrify me with visions, so that I would choose strangling and death rather than my bones. I loathe my life. I will not live forever. Let me alone, for my days are a breath. What is a man that thou dost make so much of him, and that thou dost set in thy mind upon him, dost visit him every morning, and test him every moment? How long wilt thou not look away from me, nor let me stand alone till I swallow my spittle? If I sin, what do I do to thee, thou watcher of men? Why hast thou made me thy mark? Why hast thou become a burden to thee? Why dost thou not pardon my transgression and take away my iniquity? For now I shall lie in the earth. Thou wilt seek me, but I shall not be. And now the reading from the New Testament is in John chapter 9, verses 1 to 7. As he passed by, he saw a man blind from his birth. And his disciples asked him, Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? Jesus answered, it was not that this man sinned or his parents, but that the works of God might be made manifest in him. We must work the works of him who sent me. While it is day, night comes, and when no one can work. As long as I am in the world, I am the light of the world. As he said this, he spat on the ground and made clay of the spittle and anointed the man's eyes with the clay, saying to him, go wash in the pool of Siloam. So he went and washed and came back seeing. Thus endeth the reading of the Lord.
Thanks be to God. Those of you who have been here during our entire reading of the book of Job in our sermon series would think that at the end of chapter 1, the story would come to an end. After all, the main plot of Job is that the Satan went before God and said, you know, I know you claim that Job is such a righteous person, but you know, I think the only reason why Job is so righteous is that you put a hedge around him so that nothing bad ever happens to him. Of course he's going to praise you. But you know, Lord, give me a chance. Let me break down that hedge of protection. Let me take what he values, and then we'll see just how righteous Job really is. And the Satan went so far as to predict that if you struck Job's possessions, he would curse God to God's face. Well, we found out last week at the end of chapter 1 that after Job took the Satan took everything Job had except for his wife, instead of cursing God as the Satan predicted, Job came up with this great benediction. The Lord giveth, and the Lord takes away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. Instead of cursing God, he continued to bless God. Job kept his righteousness. The Satan lost. Time to end the story and move on to the next book of the Bible, right? Now, if that's the case, what are we doing this morning looking at chapter 7 of a story that should have been over at the end of chapter 1? Furthermore, if you're like me and you start reading and you come to where you think the end is and there isn't an end, I tend to flip through the book to see how many more pages do I have to read to get to the end of this story. In case you haven't guessed, reading is not a hobby for me. But if you do like I do and flip to see how much longer we have to go through Job, you find there's 42 chapters in the book of Job. What gives? Story that should be over in chapter 1 has 42 chapters? Please. Well, for those of you who have read chapters 2 through 6 during this week, you know what has happened leading up to chapter 7. But I know there are some of you who are visiting. Some of you have missed a couple of weeks, so it may be hard to follow our sermon series. So for those of you who have not read chapters 2 through 6, I will briefly fill you in on what you missed. In chapter 2, we see God meeting the Satan once again and reminding the Satan, hey, you checked out my man Job, right? You struck him and he still praised me. However, the Satan, being a sore loser who did not want to admit defeat, comes back with a counter-argument. He says, you know what, God? You really didn't let me do enough to him. He could stand having his possessions taken, but what would have happened if you let me strike his flesh? God, instead of saying, you know what? I gave you one chance, you lost, game over, decides to take the double or nothing bet that the Satan's offering and says, you can strike his flesh. The only thing that the Satan could not do was take Job's life. As a result, the Satan strikes Job with painful sores all the way from his head down to his toes. In his agony, his wife sees him struggling with the agony and says, hey, Job, you know what? Why don't you give up this righteousness stuff, curse God, and just die? Fortunately, Job did not listen to his wife. Husbands, next time your wife says, listen to me, remember what Job's wife said. So, now don't come to me and complain if your wife takes action against your more righteous than that. But, he does not listen to his wife and instead asks a very good question. Should we accept good from God and not trouble? Once again, in chapter 2, Job's maintaining his righteousness, even with the Satan hitting Job with a 1-2 punch that were probably the 2 best shots that Job could take. The second chapter ends with 3 of Job's friends coming and spending 7 days and nights sitting with Job. At the end of the 7 days, Job starts chapter 3 with a lament. He laments the day that he was born, and he wishes that he were dead so this misery would be over. Earlier this year, I preached on Philippians chapter 1, where Paul declares, "For me to live is Christ, to die is gain." Job is in the same position that Paul was in, where that if Job had his druthers, he would be dead now rather than living through all of this torment that Job was living through. One of Job's friends, a guy named Eliphaz, offers some counsel to Job in chapters 4 and 5. To sum up the counsel he gives, he tells Job, "You know what, Job? I don't know what it is, but you must have done some sin to deserve this." Eliphaz concludes by saying that, "If I were you, Job, I'd just go before God and ask forgiveness for whatever it is you have done and see if maybe God will forgive you and take away this punishment." In our New Testament reading this morning, we see a similar train of thought to what Eliphaz is suggesting to Job when the disciples saw a person who was blind from birth. They asked Jesus, who sinned? Was it the blind man? Or since he was blind from birth, was it his parents who sinned? Eliphaz and the disciples were working on the assumption that God operates on what is sometimes called the retribution principle. That doctrine says, on one hand, God rewards good behavior, but on the other hand, he punishes bad behavior. However, Jesus told the disciples they got it all wrong. And as we discover, as we work our way through the book of Job, God does not work based on the retribution principle at all. Last week, as I was in the office, I read an interesting story in Christianity Today. The title of the article says it all. You don't have God figured out. I know many of us like trying to put God in a box where we can at least understand how God behaves. And some of us may even be so presumptuous as to have God in a box where we can control God. You know, we know that if we go to church every Sunday morning, if we attend Pastor Steve's Tuesday Bible study, if I memorize all of the books of the Bible in the order that they are found in the Bible, God will reward me. Unfortunately, God does not operate that way. He is not a domesticated God. One of my favorite books was a book that I was introduced to in 7th grade. And it is The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, which is the first book in C.S. Lewis's Chronicles of Narnia series. Early in that book, 4 kids from England find themselves in this strange land of Narnia where the animals talk. They come across a husband and wife by the name of Mr. and Mrs. Beaver. Obviously, they are beavers. They are trying to explain Aslan to these children. Aslan in this story is the god of Narnia. And when they first hear about Aslan, the children are excited. Then all of a sudden, they find out that Aslan is not a human, but is instead a lion. And they ask, is Aslan safe? And many of us think that God is pretty safe as long as we do good. Mrs. Beaver responds with, "Who said anything about being safe? But he's good." The Almighty God is not safe. If you read any of the Old Testament, you can quickly find out that God is not a predictable God. All that we can say about the Almighty is that He is good, even when His actions do not make sense. In chapters 6 and 7 of Job, we get Job's response to Eliphaz. To sum up chapter 6 and the first part of chapter 7, Job reiterates that he desires that God just crush him and let me escape all of this pain that I'm going through. Job then maintains his innocence, declaring, contrary to what Eliphaz is preaching, Job has not sinned. Then, in the second part of chapter 7, Job transitions from addressing his friends to addressing God personally. In verse 7 of this chapter, Job states the obvious. He's just a breath. So God, what is so important about me personally? Then, in verse 11, we pick up with our reading that Tom started with this morning, where Job declares he's not going to keep silent. The 7 days of his silence has made him realize that in his condition right now, he has nothing to lose, so he's going to let God have it with both barrels blazing. He starts off by asking if he was such a threat to the Creator of the universe that the Almighty has to keep him under constant surveillance 24/7, 365, and on leap years, that 366th day, God's paying even more attention. When Job mentions the sea and the sea monster, he is referring to creation stories that were common in the ancient world. We know that at the beginning, the earth was formless. Ancient societies considered that the seas represented chaos that the gods had to control. The sea monster was another symbol of chaos, and many creation legends had the gods having to fight the sea monster to subdue it, so that in the chaos of the sea monster, creation was not ruined. Job is sarcastically asking, am I such a threat to creation that you have to keep me constantly under your thumb like I were the sea or the sea monster? Then in verses 13 and 14, Job complains that even when he goes to bed, God tortures him. Now, I know one of the things is, no matter how bad the day is, most of us like going to bed and we'll sleep, and in the morning, things will be better in the morning. The problem with Job is when he tried to sleep, even then, God was torturing him with bad dreams and visions. The one place where Job thought that he could run to to get reprieve from the pain, even that place was taken away from him. Then in verses 17 through 19, Job does a parody on Psalm 8. As we read in the morning call to worship, David expresses grateful awe that God remembers humanity. In Job, we see the protagonist acknowledging that God is constantly surveilling us. However, instead of being a source of joy like it is for the psalmist, Job finds it a source of anguish. Job complains about how God is testing humanity every moment of every day. He is like the cop hiding in the bushes, just waiting for the person to go 72 miles an hour in a 70 zone so he can come out of the bushes and pull over and write the ticket. Job goes so far as to inquire, God, can you take your eyes off me just for a second? Or as some of the translations say, can you at least let me spit in privacy? Job feels like 24/7 he's being hounded by God. And he's tired of it. In verse 20, Job gets down to where he asks God, even if, hypothetically, even if I have sinned, what have I done to you? No, Job is proclaiming his innocence. And God, in the first 2 chapters of the book, even proudly boast about how righteous Job was. And yet, even though Job is righteous, he feels like God is picking him out to be the subject of his scrutiny for some unknown reason. I love how Eugene Peterson in The Message captures the flavor of Job's complaint in verse 20. Peterson writes, Job asking this question, Lord, don't you have anything better to do? Why are you making a federal case out of this? Job is not getting what God is doing because he, like Eliphaz and like the disciples, was under the assumption that when we do good, God rewards us. When we do bad, God is punishing us. So, why is Job being punished? Then at the end of verse 20, we have what the experts call a textual variant. And those textual variances make me glad that I no longer am in seminary, because no professor can ask me to do a whole bunch of research and write a term paper on it. The textual variance has, in the oldest manuscripts, and the NIV follows the oldest manuscripts, Job is asking God if he has become a burden to the Almighty. However, some of the ancient rabbis found this question to be a little too presumptuous. So they marked the margins of the text with what they believed the manuscript should read. And in those translations that follow the ancient rabbis, the reading is, I have become a burden to myself, instead of, have I become a burden to you? Now I know from time to time, from this pulpit, I mention how the NIV doesn't quite get it right. Well, this time, I'm going to say the NIV got it absolutely correct. I enjoy the fact that Job is getting down and dirty with God. It shows that it is possible to be brutally honest with the Almighty and still maintain our righteousness. There are times in all of our lives where we wonder, what in the world is God thinking? This Wednesday and Thursday, as I was waiting to hopefully have my street cleared enough that I could leave the house, I was wondering, Lord, why Saratoga, Wyoming? Fortunately, now that I'm able to drive around, Saratoga, Wyoming's looking pretty good again. Job ends his monologue in chapter 7 with a final question. And that question is, God, if, and again, it's the if, it's the hypothetical, if I have done something wrong, why don't you just pardon me? Once again, Job is not admitting to any sin. However, he is to the point where if there was some sin in his life, he's wondering, why doesn't God just pardon him? After all, whatever sin Job might have committed can't be all this serious that you wipe out all of my possessions, all of my family except my wife who tells me to curse God and die, and then strike me with painful sores. I can't be that bad, can I, God? As we get to the end of our scripture reading today, we get to the application part of this message. I believe there are two things that we need to take away from this passage. The first thing is we need to reject any idea that God operates on the retribution principle that believes that if we do everything right, God will reward us, and anytime we are getting punished, it is because we have some bad behavior. Unfortunately, even today, there are plenty of Christians who believe this is how God works. Some of them are even very popular television evangelists. They believe that if you are suffering, it must be because you have some unconfessed sin in your life. However, that is not how God works. As we saw in John 9's reading this morning, Jesus himself rejects the idea that God works in such a way. We cannot declare with authority that if someone is suffering some ailment, it is because God is punishing the afflicted person. Both our Old Testament and our New Testament reading provides proof that God does not operate that way. While it is true, our suffering may be due to God disciplining us, it could be just as easily a false statement. As I mentioned earlier in this message, if you think you have God figured out, you don't. God acts in strange and mysterious ways. The other lesson that I hope we would take away from this morning's message is when we are trying to counsel or comfort people through their times of grief, we need to be careful with what we say. Often, the best thing that we can do is just be there and lend a sympathetic ear. Job's friends, when they were sitting with Job silently, were doing well. However, as you would read, as you read through the book of Job, when his friends tried to give advice, all that they're demonstrating is just how little they really know about God. May we be people who are always willing to let God be God and be open to the possibility that God is doing new things in our life. Amen.
Amen.